If you enjoy this video, please consider giving a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you have any ideas for future videos, share them in the comments section below. This original bedtime story is made possible thanks to Slumberland patrons. If you would like to support this channel, you can find Patreon details in the description and on my channel homepage. So as you just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this sleep story in the background. And I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or to the spaces between my words. And as you drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this story about Tiffany. And Tiffany was gazing up at the northern lights while she rested back on that snow which cracked gently beneath her with every slight movement. She could see her breath rising up with each out-breath. She could feel the coolness of the air with each in-breath. And she could watch that dancing light show in the sky overhead. And while watching that light show overhead, she thought back over what it took for her to get here and all that she's accomplished. And 3 days earlier, Tiffany was relaxing in her back garden, looking through her telescope at Saturn. And she was enjoying that sensation or feeling of drifting and floating in space as all that she could perceive was what she could see through the eyepiece of Saturn and its moons and its rings, floating so gracefully through space, floating gently across the field of view of the telescope. And she could hear the subtle sounds in her garden, but her attention was absorbed in what she could see through that telescope, almost as if silence descended around her, as if she was genuinely floating in space, some distance from Saturn. And she found the experience so peaceful, so calming. And after a while of watching Saturn through her telescope, she heard a noise coming from the end of her garden. And this noise distracted her, so she left her telescope, turned on a torch, and walked down towards the end of her garden. And as she approached the end of her garden, so she noticed a pixie buzzing around near the flowers. And she'd never seen a pixie before, and until now would never have believed in such a thing. And the pixie flew up to the height of Tiffany's face, and hovering in front of Tiffany, asked Tiffany in their gentle voice to follow them down a rabbit hole. And Tiffany thought this was a weird and unusual request. The pixie flew down, and Tiffany followed, and the pixie started walking along the ground, walking through the flower bed, until it walked to a rabbit hole, And Tiffany said that I can't fit down that rabbit hole. I'm too big. And the pixie said, just follow me. It'll all happen by itself. And so she just followed behind that pixie. And as she followed, so she shrunk, and she got smaller and smaller, until she was the same size as the pixie. And the two of them walked through that rabbit hole. And in this rabbit hole, they transitioned to a glowing tunnel that seemed to almost have a green glow down and around the inside of this tunnel. And as she looked around and looked at the green glow, she saw that it was coming from what looked almost like glowing fungus that was wrapped around the inside of this tunnel. And she followed that tunnel, following that pixie, until eventually they exited the other end of this tunnel. And Tiffany found herself in a strange and magical land, heading into a woodland. And the pixie said to Tiffany that they need her help, that the Earth's magnetic field is weakening, and the Earth's core needs to be re-energized to strengthen the magnetic field again. And she has a lot of experience climbing mountains and being an adventurer in extreme weather. She's the best person for the job. And that the pixies had been watching her to try and see who was right for the job. They'd been watching many others, but she was the one that they felt if they appeared before her, she would be more accepting of them, and that she had the skills that they required as well. And Tiffany said, it sounds interesting, but she doesn't know how she can help. That she's comfortable with travelling to the North Pole. She's comfortable with extreme weather, but she doesn't know how to restart the core of a planet. And the pixie said, just follow me and I'll take you to the fortune teller, and the fortune teller will reveal all. And so they head through the woodland, head through a meadow, and Tiffany follows that pixie all the way to the fortune teller's house. They enter the fortune teller's house, and the pixie gestures for Tiffany to sit at a table, and the fortune teller comes out, sits down opposite Tiffany. And the fortune teller swirls around the leftovers of a cup of tea, pours out the last little bit of liquid from the cup, and starts gazing at the tea leaves. And while gazing at the tea leaves, they start to talk, and they explain to Tiffany what her future will be in relation to re-energizing the planet's core. They explain to her that she needs to find the leprechaun who'll build a device which she'll have to activate at the magnetic North Pole. And after the reading, the pixie and Tiffany leave the fortune teller. They head off through the magical land in search of the leprechaun. They pass out through woodland, beyond a vast meadow of undulating hills, walking down to a stream and following that stream all the way towards a nearby town. And as they head into the town, so the pixie points out that the leprechaun is the one who's outside their property over there, carving a sculpture. And they walk to that property, and the leprechaun is outside their property, chiseling away, stepping back, looking at what they're doing, going back to the sculpture, chiseling away a little bit more, stepping back, so absorbed in making that sculpture. And the pixie introduces Tiffany and says that the fortune teller told us that we needed to find you. And the pixie explained the situation about the device that was needed. And the leprechaun said that they think that they can probably make that device. It'll take them a little while to do, but they're confident they can achieve it. And they follow that leprechaun into their house. And Tiffany has a look around the leprechaun's house and can see clockwork items all around the shelves, clocks on the walls, lots of wooden items and carvings, the most comfortable chairs with fur throws. The leprechaun heads down to the basement of the house, and they can hear that leprechaun working. They can hear hammering and sawing. And while the leprechaun worked, so Tiffany nosed around the books on the shelves in the leprechaun's house, before heading out for a walk, heading down the street, heading to the stream, following that stream, to a stone that she gently sat on, while listening to a nearby waterfall. And as she listened to that water, she watched butterflies in the meadow opposite, flying from flower to flower. She noticed birds flying in the sky. She was surprised how similar this land seemed to her own, and yet she was aware this is almost like a miniature land, because she's only the height of the pixie. But everything here seems relative. The butterflies seem the right size for butterflies, and yet she knows that if she was her normal height, those butterflies would be so small she wouldn't even be able to see them. And as the sun began to set, Tiffany headed back to the leprechaun's house. And the leprechaun was just finishing up making that device. And the device looked like a clockwork device that resembled a metallic baton with cogs. And the leprechaun handed Tiffany the device that they had made, and explained to Tiffany that she will need to plant it into the ground at the magnetic North Pole and turn it on, and that this baton, this device, would start sending out a directional resonant frequency towards the Earth's core, which will synchronize with the core. And then the core will begin vibrating faster and faster and getting hotter and hotter. And as the core gets hotter and hotter, so it'll strengthen the magnetic field. And once the magnetic field is fully strengthened, the device will detect that the magnetic field has increased in strength and is stable at this increased level, and will then power down. And Tiffany and the pixie thanked the leprechaun for their help. And as it was late now, the leprechaun said, "Why don't you stay the night? You can head back the next day." And the two of them agreed that they would spend the night at the leprechaun's house. The leprechaun prepared them some food, and they ate that food, enjoyed the conversation, relaxed in front of the fire for a while, listening to stories from the leprechaun, before heading to bed and drifting and floating so peacefully, so comfortably asleep. And the next day, Tiffany and the pixie headed back through this magical realm. And while they walked back through the magical realm, the pixie explained that part of their role as magical beings from this realm is to help to protect the earth. But sometimes they need additional help. But being magical means that people rarely believe them when they see them. They don't believe their eyes. They don't trust their senses. They dismiss what they have experienced. And Tiffany could understand how this would be the case. When they arrive back at that glowing tunnel, they head through that glowing tunnel. They exit that glowing tunnel through the rabbit hole into Tiffany's garden. And Tiffany is surprised as they pass into her garden, and she gets larger and larger and goes back to her normal size, to discover that almost no time seemed to have passed in Earth time, and that all that time that had passed in the magical realm hadn't passed here. And the pixie explained to Tiffany that she'll need to set off the next day, so she needs to make her preparations before heading to bed, because it's urgent she gets to the magnetic North Pole as soon as possible to be able to save the magnetic field of the planet. And so Tiffany heads into her house. She makes the necessary preparations, booking flights, places to stay, preparing her clothes, before heading to bed. And as she drifts and floats comfortably asleep, so she relaxes deeply and peacefully, sleeping so soundly. And the next morning, Tiffany awakens, prepared to set off on her journey. She gathers up her clothing, all the belongings she feels that she'll need. She travels off to catch a flight that will take her to as near to her destination as she can get. And as the plane lands, she leaves the airport and she gets a taxi to the nearest town to the magnetic North Pole. And once she arrives at that town, she goes and gets a sled and some huskies, which she'll be making the rest of her journey on. And she leaves that town in the direction of the magnetic North Pole, heading out into the darkness and the cold of the Arctic. She can feel the bracing wind against her cheeks as those huskies pull her through that snow. The sounds of those huskies communicating with each other as she communicates with them. The sound of that sled scraping along through the surface of the snow. The panting of those huskies. The spray of the snow from the feet of the huskies. And after some time, they reach the destination. She slows those huskies to a halt. She sets up a tent, packs a bit of snow around the outside of that tent, and at an angle around the tent, sets up a campfire in front of the entrance to the tent, lights that campfire. Just a short walk from the magnetic North Pole. And once everything is set up, she then makes that short walk away from the camp, carrying that baton, carrying that device. She follows the compass to the magnetic North Pole. And once at the magnetic North Pole, she plants that device in the ground, turns the device on, and cogs whirl. Half the baton twists and pops up higher. And then a vibrating, almost pounding sound, almost like the device is pounding into the earth at the frequency of the Earth's core, begins to happen. And she walks back away from that device once it seems to be activated and doing its job. She heads back to the tent. She sits just inside the tent with the warmth of that campfire in front of her, is surprised by the stillness of the night. with just the gentle flickering light of the campfire illuminating the night, glowing off the snow, that orange glow. She gazes over towards the device and can hear that faint, vibrating, pounding into the earth sound. And as she sits there in the entrance to the tent, gazing out into the darkness, looking up at that inky black sky peppered with stars. After many hours, she begins to notice the aurora becoming more vivid, the dancing light and colour in the sky, almost like waving sheets in the wind. And she watches in amazement at the vividness of that aurora. Until she notices that the sound of the device has stopped. And she's aware that the core must now fully be re-energized. And she watches in silence for a while, enjoying that light show, with just the gentle sound of the huskies resting, the gentle sound of the fire crackling, enjoying the dancing light in the sky. She heads over to the device, picks the device up from the ground, notices it's stopped, packs that device away, heads back to her tent, sits for a little longer in her tent, gazing up at the sky. Interested at the journey she's gone on to get here. How far she had to come. How it was only a few nights earlier she was stood in her garden, looking at Saturn through a telescope, when she encountered that pixie. The next day she'd set off, and the day after that she'd arrived in this area. And now it's the early hours of the following morning, and the sun hasn't risen. That this area at this time of year is in an almost perpetual darkness in this location. And she finds this experience so profound. And she finds it difficult to judge just from looking exactly what time it is now. And she heads into her tent, zips up her tent, snuggles down in a sleeping bag, and comfortably and relaxed drifts and floats peacefully asleep. And after sleeping for some time, she awakens to make her journey home. She packs everything away, covers over the fire. Heads back on those huskies, on that sled, all the way back to the town, knowing that most people will probably not even be aware of what she has done and the problem that she solved, or that there was even a problem in the first place. And she heads back to the airport. She makes her journey all the way home. And once home, she settles in. She looks forward to sleeping in her bed. She sleeps in her bed, drifts and floats so peacefully, so comfortably asleep after the adventure she's had. And the next day, as evening approaches, she sets her telescope up in her garden. And as night falls and Saturn rises in the sky, she continues what she was doing a few days earlier, observing Saturn and its moons and its rings through a telescope, imagining herself drifting and floating in space. And while she's doing this, so she hears a noise again and sees that pixie which comes over to her and thanks her for her help, before saying that they'll need to take the baton, take the device away with them. And so Tiffany goes and gets the device, and as she hands that device over to the pixie, so the device shrinks down as it's reaching the pixie, so that as the pixie takes the device, by the time it's fully in the pixie's hands, the device is the appropriate size for the pixie to hold, rather than the size it was when she was holding it. It's gone from being about as long as her forearm to being about the size of a small capsule or a pill. As that pixie takes that away, once again thanking Tiffany for her help, and heads off into the darkness. And Tiffany just continues looking through her telescope with a smile on her face, thinking about what she had done, the experience that she'd had. And after looking for a while at Saturn and its moons, she heads inside, heads to bed, settles down and drifts and floats so peacefully, so calmly, relaxed asleep, knowing she's going to sleep so soundly all night long, knowing she's going to awaken feeling so refreshed, so revitalized, so full of energy, ready to carry on with the next day as she drifts and floats so peacefully, so relaxed asleep.